Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this session on charitable giving in the United States. I'm Doug Stewart, Chairman of the Board at Marts&Lundy, and I'm joined by three distinguished colleagues. We're going to be looking at the Giving USA results for 2019 and then pivoting to 2020 and thinking about what's going on in this extraordinary year. Let me introduce my colleagues before I make a couple of opening remarks. Nancy Raybin, Lynne, LaMarca, Heinrich, and Penelepe Hunt, all senior consultants with Marts&Lundy, and we'll be hearing more from them shortly. Each year we look forward to studying the results of the Giving USA report, partly because it gives us a chance to benchmark our organization's performance with the results of the nation. Also, it gives us a chance in some cases to think about how those results may inform the current year. However, we've never seen a year like 2020. It began with the presidential impeachment, which created political instability. We immediately moved into a global pandemic, which created health instability and economic instability. And now we've moved into a period of exceptional concerns and demonstrations about racial injustice, creating social instability. So whether the results of 2019 have any bearing on 2020 is something that we'll want to talk about in this session. I'm going to turn it over to Nancy Raybin to walk us through the Giving USA 2019 results. Nancy is particularly familiar with this data and with the methodology used by Giving USA because she is a past chair of the Giving Institute and of the Giving USA Foundation, which produces the Giving USA report on charitable giving. So Nancy Raybin, let me turn it over to you to walk us through the highlights of 2019 charitable giving in the United States.
Thank you, Doug. First, a little look back and an understanding of where we have come from, if you will. Giving USA began approximately 65 years ago when fundraising firms, including Marts&Lundy, gathered this information from their clients and produced a very rough hand-typed compendium of giving. Fast forward to now, the Giving USA Foundation and the Lilly School Center on Philanthropy have a successful collaboration to further expand the methodology, add some scholars, delve deeper into the related philanthropic issues. Obviously, the research in the book moved online and everywhere else. In terms of the numbers, a few things to pay attention to. The estimates are good for today. They're revised for at least the next 2 years as more IRS information becomes available. So there's sometimes frustration that the numbers last year are not the same numbers this year. So it has to do with revisions. The models that are used have been well tested, but sometimes adjustments are made for significant stock market fluctuations, mega gifts, which are defined at 300 million and over, and disasters. The year-to-year numbers are interesting, but note that a significant change in one year can result in the opposite in the next year, and large percentages changes are less likely in the larger recipient organizations. We're also going to focus on inflation-adjusted numbers. Giving USA presents both, but it's easier to make comparisons over 40 years if we're using the inflation numbers. So a note about our appreciation for all of you who've joined us. We know that you're sophisticated and experienced fundraisers. The information that we're sharing here today is important, but it's unlikely to redirect your fundraising strategy in any fundamental way, but it's important. And these trends provide some background to help us educate new donors who are new to philanthropy and don't understand and aren't fully immersed in where this all happens. It's also important to think about allocating resources among individual, corporate, foundation, and planned giving programs. And some of the results we're sharing today may make you think about reallocating some of those resources. And quite frankly, there's a need to take comfort in our country's rich and generous philanthropic tradition. We can take a look at the next slide. This is just a sort of ongoing good news over 40 years. 2019 was an okay year. Giving increased a little over 2%. With the revised numbers, giving was in fact down the year before last. So we're flat, but at such a high level of $450 billion, that's still good news. As Doug suggested, as we all know, 2020 is going to be different and different again. And some of the concerns that were in place last year are still going to affect us moving forward to 2020. What I plan to do is go over the numbers, largely reflecting on 2019's, with some hints about where we get to 2020. And Doug and Lynne and Penelepe will take us further into 2020 and what we are seeing and what you might be able to expect. So the first chart of these findings we call the donut, shows the shares of each sector, the percentage, the dollar amount, the percentage, and the next slide, but I'll combine some of that thinking in this slide as we talk about each of the sectors. The largest sector has always been religion at 29% of the total, raising $128 billion. There's not much growth here. And in fact, religion has, at one time when I started with this organization, was well over 50% of the whole. But what has happened is as donors became comfortable in their broader philanthropy, and as other sectors became much better organized, the increase in the pie, the increase in giving went to the other organizations. And while religion may have stayed the same dollar-wise, it reduced significantly its percentage of the whole. It's important also to note that in this religion category are all the social services that churches and synagogues and mosques provide under their umbrella, if you will. And in recessions, we often see more money going to religion. A lot of it is going to help these social service organizations. The next sector is education. Education includes K through 12 education, as well as libraries, as well as higher education, although higher education is by far the largest part. Higher education raised $64 billion last year, 14% of the total, and we've seen a significant increase in education. In past recessions, and perhaps what we can expect next year, is some of this giving goes towards human services. It seems to be that donors move their money in that direction. However, over the 40 years, one of the things that we've seen is the type of infrastructure that higher education has in place to raise money is emulated by the other sectors. And it's that very infrastructure, the staff, the programs that move these philanthropic organizations out of the recession and back to more robust giving. One other point about higher education, and it's fairly obvious, is that the strong stock market supports large giving, and those large gifts in many ways go to education. Penelepe will discuss this further when we get to the second part of this presentation. The third area is human services, $56 billion, 12% of the total, and it's grown 3%. It's important to note that organizations, these are direct service organizations, and organizations like the United Way are categorized under public society benefit. In terms of grant-making organizations, we've seen an increase in grant-making organizations. These are private, family, and community foundations. The donor-advised funds are not here, but what we have seen as tax law changes were put in place in 2017, beginning in 2016, more money by families was moved into this sector. In terms of health, health is a complex sector because it includes not only hospitals, the nonprofit hospitals, but all the health advocacy groups. And clearly different factors affect the growth in each of those. Last year, there was a 5% increase, up to $41 billion. A lot of major gifts, grateful patient programs, and really successful events by the various advocacy organizations. But looking forward, there are going to be struggles and challenges, and the different parts of this segment, the hospitals dealing with COVID, and the advocacy organizations who aren't dealing with COVID but dealing with equally important organizations issues, are seeing some of their fundraising challenged. The next group is public society benefit, and it has evolved in a strange way. It includes the United Ways, it includes Jewish federations, it includes advocacy groups, it includes some of the think tanks, and all of the commercial funds. So Fidelity and Schwab are very much a part of this sector. The donor-advised funds are included here, and it's important to note that there's a net inflow-outflow, so there's no double counting. But clearly, the growth of donor-advised funds in 2019, but more importantly, what we're seeing is the growth in 2020. It's here that that we're seeing a change, and I think that's an area to watch and an area that's different. But it's interesting to note that the donor-advised funds are not in foundations, they're here in public society benefit. The Arts and Culture Group raised almost $22 billion last year, 5% of the total, and the increase is 11%. The wealthy donors have contributed to these organizations, same as higher education, with large gifts and even larger campaigns. But the challenges are ahead, and Lynne will be referring to some of those that the organizations face as they move into 2020, as they move further into 2020. The group on international affairs, $29 billion, 6% of the total. International affairs are driven by disasters and the attention that media puts on those disasters. It's money that comes to United States, U.S. organizations, or U.S. friends of international organizations. There were no disasters of the size and magnitude of past years in 2019, so that number is somewhat has decreased, and that will change. And the sad thing is that these organizations doing the work they do around the world are probably more in need of money than they have even in the past. But donors in the United States focusing on domestic issues may not tend to see it the same way. And finally, environment is almost 30 million giving, 3% of the total, and is increasing. Climate change is an important issue. Whether climate change and the pandemic, which are related, will be compelling messages in the coming year. We hope so, personally, but I think that it's important to see what challenges those groups face as well. If we turn to the next slide, taking a look at giving by sources, we take a look at individuals, always the largest amount. I think now everybody fully appreciates that it's the individuals that make up the largest percentage of the pie. That always wasn't the case. But this number, 69%, is less than 70% 2 years in a row, and there's great concern. However, individuals are still key to all of this because individuals living and individuals dead in terms of bequest, plus part of the foundations that are really family foundations and really individual directed monies, still add up to 86%. So despite the decline in individual giving, it's still a huge and important sector. Some concerns though, the shift in itemizers with the tax law change from almost 50% to 17% really affects how these calculations are done. And I don't think the Lilly School knows completely all of the impact of the reduction in itemizers and the impact on smaller donors. So that's something that I think we have 2 years now. We're seeing some impact in annual funds, and we're seeing some impact on broader online appeals. Again, giving to donor advised funds is from individuals, but it goes into the public society, and it's not counted as foundation money. Crowdfunding money is very popular, but only the crowdfunding money that goes to a 501c3 organization would be included. And none of the money that's from individuals to individuals is included here. And I think the overall concern is that fewer households are involved in giving than once were. In terms of foundations, This 17% number is really a huge number. 20 years ago, that number was 5%. 10 years later, it's 11%, and now it's 17%. Assets and foundations are growing. More foundations are are coming into being. The 5% minimum, some foundations go beyond that, and now we're seeing that the effort to make more foundations go beyond that number are important. But clearly, foundations, which were once 5% when individuals were 86%, are now 17%. And to not pay attention to foundations and the role that they play and the role they're going to play would make a mistake, would be a mistake in thinking about how you're allocating resources. And now what we saw just a few weeks ago is the potential for foundations to borrow money at 0%, to leverage that and to continue to give more money suggests that foundations are going to be a bigger part of this whole pie in 2020. Finally, well, the quests, it's hard to predict, but it's not hard to plan. And so the planned giving portion of organizations seemingly should play a much bigger role. But this number is a number that we cannot predict. It is often affected by the settlement of large estates. I don't believe we had large estates that settled in 2019. In terms of corporations, that 5% number has always been 5%, as far as I can remember. The Chronicle of Philanthropy used the word surge because there was an increase this year, but in fact, it's still 5%. And these are philanthropic events philanthropic gifts and gifts to events. But largely, this whole form of giving is fueled by in-kind gifts, and largely from the pharmaceutical companies. Now we're seeing some signature philanthropic gifts from Walmart and Bank of America as it relates to COVID-19, and I'm sure we're going to see more gifts as it relates to Black Lives Matter. But at this point, the philanthropic part of corporations is going to be severely challenged by their financial performance this year. And again, it doesn't include any of the marketing dollars or the sponsorship dollars. That's not included in philanthropic giving. Move to the next slide. So the important point on this slide is that education, health, public society benefit, arts, culture, humanities, and the environment have all seen significant increases. In fact, every organization, every sector has seen increases, but those in particular around 10%. And it's notable in 2019. Will that continue? Off of very good years? Usually the numbers are such that it's hard to see those increases continue. But the point here is that everybody participated in an increase, and some sectors more so. If we move to the next slide, in terms of uses, again, what we see is that last year in the total it was down 2.5%, increased 2.4%, so we're barely even in the total numbers. The individual giving has increased slightly, foundations just a little bit. Bequest, again, there's no control over bequest, and then we have this surge in corporations, which doesn't necessarily amount to that much in terms of dollars. So we're heading into 2020 with a strong in all sectors, but not certainly a whopping increase in any of them, and certainly some indicators in terms of what individuals are doing, what foundations could be doing, and where some of the preferences are. Next slide. Our favorite chart, and one we hope that you use in your organizations all the time. It's the most positive chart there is, 40 years of giving. There were 9 times when giving by inflation numbers were flat. But that's quite a remarkable success for our country to go to $450 billion through recessions, through 9/11, through Katrina, through other earlier recessions, and come out this strong. So whenever you feel a little sad, pull this chart out, because it says what we're doing makes sense and it's the right thing to do, and we're taking it in the right direction. Finally, the second favorite chart is giving remains sort of at 2% of GDP. Well, there's a big difference between 1.6% and 2%. And for us to get to 2.5% would mean a lot of mega gifts to the arts area, to higher education, to healthcare, to the environment, to a number of places that can use and accept and thrive on these large gifts. It's encouraging that we're still at 2%. There's no indication that it'll be less than that, and the numbers work in a way. If GDP goes down and philanthropy goes up, maybe we will increase that numbers. But for this country to keep our giving at this level is really an optimistic perspective. One final. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm going to come back to Nancy and Lynn and Penelope now to do a little analysis of the 2019 numbers and to think about whether 2020 will resemble any year in the history of charitable giving. Lynn, LaMarca, Heinrich, are these results for 2019, are they good news or bad news?
Well, they're good news. I mean, they show increases. They show the continued trend upwards since the end of the recession. And they show strong giving in all categories, but international. So they are good news. I think the question is whether or not they really tell us a lot about 2020. And we know that 2020 is going to be a very difficult year. We go into it, I think, with eyes wide open as we move from this good news to the last 6 months, which has been challenging. But they've been great news in terms of arts and culture, animals and environment, especially, two categories that are very near and dear to my heart. We've seen those areas really build in terms of their popularity with philanthropy and much stronger participation from a broader group of people. So we're really delighted about that.
Great. Well, so Penelope Hunt, if 2019 was a great year, does that mean that we have a tailwind? Do we have momentum going into 2020?
Well, yes, we have momentum, but no matter how much momentum you have, if you're going 70 miles an hour and you run into a brick wall, you're still going to come to a major change in your plans for the day. So the momentum that brought us into 2020 is clearly going to be affected by the triple or quadruple whammy of the major societal, public health, and overall economic issues, Doug, that you identified at the beginning of this session. Any one of those might affect giving behavior, particularly at the very high levels and the very low levels. So the kind of crowdfunding participation giving is often swayed by political causes and societal causes. Massive gifts are very much affected by the kinds of things we have been facing in the past 6 months. So while we don't really know what's going to change, I think it's safe for us to assume that the second half of 2020 is going to be very different than the second half of 2019 was.
Mm-hmm. So we're interested, as we start talking about 2020, to hear from all of you in the audience about what you're seeing. And so we have a poll question for you, and I'd like to go to that now, to ask how much you are raising and whether you think that your fiscal year fundraising results are going to be above goal, at goal, or below goal. And so please take a moment to vote on the screen as to whether you think your organization's fundraising results for the fiscal year will be above goal, at goal, or below goal, and we'll share those results in just a minute. While we're voting on that, Penelope, I want to stick with you and ask you what's going on with foundations. 17% of the total now. Is there anything interesting that we should be aware of there?
I think there are a lot of trends in foundation giving that are important for us to pay attention to. The increase of foundation giving across the board, of course, but also over the past decade or so, we've seen many foundations taking on causes and moving from distributing money according to a static list of criteria into taking on initiatives of their own. And that has clearly been seen at the really huge foundations. Now in these past 6 months, during the economic effects of the pandemic, we saw a lot of large foundations reaching out to their grant recipients and saying, it's okay to take that restricted grant we gave you and turn it into unrestricted operating to help, particularly in the fields like arts and culture, where gate receipts went and ticket receipts went from a huge proportion of their income to none. And now, as Nancy referenced, the unprecedented events of the last few weeks with massive foundations borrowing so that they can give more, and a lot of them saying, we're not going to stick to our 5%. We're comfortable going above that and making larger distributions. And it's important for everyone to remember that during recessionary periods, which technically we're in, even though the markets don't seem to have noticed that we're in a recessionary period. Some days the markets notice and then other days they don't. But foundations, because they make their distributions off their endowment value on a rolling average, are not affected by dips in the markets the way individuals are. The effect on a foundation's outlay is delayed by 2 to 3 years, in some cases even 4 to 5 years, depending on how they calculate their rolling average. So foundations tend to carry us through recessionary periods while individuals are adjusting. And then as individual money and giving rebounds, the risk is that we often forget that down markets will catch up with foundations eventually. So we forget that 2 or 3 years from now, we need to be prepared for the fact that foundation payouts will go down with the markets. Right now, the markets are holding steady for the last 20 minutes or so. But as we've seen over the last month, up, down, up, down, up, down, a lot of people who know a lot about markets are saying that the overall effect will be down markets for 2020. So don't forget that by 2022 and 23, your foundation grants will probably be declining because whatever the markets end up at as in 2020 will be hitting your foundation donors then.
Great. Thanks, Penelope. Let's go to the results of our poll. So about half of you are saying that your fundraising results are going to be below goal. Only a small number are saying, 16% saying that they're projecting that their fundraising results will be above goal. And we didn't have the ability to do this in this poll, but it would be really interesting to find out who is saying that they are going to be above goal, whether they're healthcare organizations, which I suspect many of them are, as opposed to arts and culture organizations, which are almost certainly below goal. Wouldn't you imagine, Lynne, Heinrich?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I think our, go ahead.
Yeah, Lynne, go ahead. You're one of the leading consultants in the arts and culture space. What are you seeing in the arts and culture area?
Well, it's a really tough moment for arts and culture, and actually we're just worried about the survivability of many of our groups at this point. If you look at particularly the performing arts, typically over half of their income annually comes from earned revenue, which is tickets and restaurants and gift shops and all of that. And we've literally not been performing since March. And what we are hearing, most of our organizations are about to, if they haven't already, cancel performances through December. And many we know are actually budgeting based on no performances of any sort through a year from now, literally June 21. So that varies state by state. Some of the visual arts organizations and Outdoor Arboreta are actually opening at this moment. MFA Houston is leading the charge on the museum side. We've got the Huntington that's opening shortly. So we are starting to see opening, and that's going to help the earned income side. But these are really devastating hits to the bottom line. Most of our arts organizations, or many of them, we should say, did get PPP. That will help them through this month. or next month, depending on when they got it and through the extension. But we anticipate significant layoffs and furloughs, and they have already started to happen in that moment. So I think there's some good news here. I want to give you the good news as well as all that really hard picture of the arts. You know, the ticket donation data that we are starting to get is really heartening. So most of our organizations that are performing arts organizations actually offered 3 options for tickets in March, April, May, and now through the summer. They offered credit, outright refunds, or donations. And our organizations are seeing amazing donations from that population. And in some cases, I'll give you 2 of my own clients, 608 new donors, or 25% of tickets donated back. And another organization, 35% of tickets donated back, that represents almost 1,800 new donors. These are brand new donors to the organization. So I think that will really help us in terms of our expanding our audience base. It shows tremendous philanthropy, which is really exciting for us, and great opportunities for cultivation and bringing in new audiences. I think also we've seen phenomenal stewardship activity in the last 3 months that will pay off in spades, short-term and long-term. And one of my groups, again, a call out to them, 3,300 stewardship calls from every sector of their organization. So musicians, trustees, administrative staff, as well as all the development staff and everyone else. So that stewardship activity has been really important. Also, I would say bright spots, you know, having to go online very quickly is also allowing us to really tackle, particularly with the arts, the opportunity to expand our audiences. We've had a very hard time, especially with our performing arts, in building that new audience base. And so what we're seeing is a lot of the online efforts are really gaining tremendous traction, both in terms of fundraising with some of the galas that have been going on, but also just the general great cultivation, stewardship, and education work that's going on. And we're seeing whole new audiences that are coming into those virtual platforms and engaging with our audiences. So I think all of that, tremendously wonderful. The one challenge, I think, for the arts short term, in addition to what I already spoke about, is we are seeing our donors prioritizing social service and health in this first wave. But what we are hearing from our same donors and from our major foundations is they will be looking to those bedrock cultural institutions on the second wave. And that could be as early as late summer or in the fall, where they'll really look at those institutions that will help rebuild their communities. And many of our arts organizations are really integral and critical to doing that. And we expect that they will then start to see some of the largesse of some of our major philanthropists that are currently distracted with giving to social service.
Yeah. Lynn, what about in the environmental sector and animals? Are we seeing different challenges there?
Yeah, so different challenges because they don't have the same needs from an earned income standpoint that our arts groups do. So they've been typically historically more reliant on philanthropy, smaller endowments largely, but more reliant on philanthropy. And so their challenges, what they're seeing is some of the issues that we're seeing at large. We're now down to 73% of households giving to philanthropy, as opposed to a recession period was 79%. So we're seeing the erosion of tax reform, which hits heavy membership-based organizations, which our environmental conservation groups tend to be. And so they have to rely even more heavily on that top population. But we saw a big increase in the 2019 data, or 2020 Giving USA data, for environment conservation, which is great. We're seeing younger people in that space, which is really terrific, and some really important philanthropists actually entering into that space. And we're really excited about that. And then there is the crossover between COVID, pandemic, and animals right now. So we're seeing some kick up from that as well.
Great, thanks. Penelepe, what about in the education sector? Anything stick out to you as noteworthy so far in 2020, or looking ahead in your crystal ball?
Well, my crystal ball is very cloudy these days because there are so many unknowns in the education realm, particularly in higher education. The preparation for moving to all online education was begun by virtue of the fact that so many, especially universities, have some component of online learning already incorporated into their curriculum. So when they had to move to full online learning, they at least were a few steps ahead of those organizations that didn't have anything like that in place yet. Whether that can really be maintained over the course of an entire school year out into the fiscal 2021 year is a big open question. And for our independent schools, which are not as conducive to online learning, and most of which did not have any kind of online learning platform in place to begin with, this has been a very difficult pivot, and for boarding schools particularly. And both at the higher education level and the independent school level, reliance on tuition from international students is huge, because typically international students don't qualify for financial aid, so they pay full tuition. And with the current travel restrictions in place, many of those students, unless things change radically in the next quarter, won't be able to return to the US for educational purposes. And that will be a second financial body blow to these institutions. So I think until we have a better sense at our schools at every level from K through PhD of what the next school year will look like, we're not going to know then what the financial model for those institutions will look like, which means we don't know what the effect on the advancement operations will be. I would say that probably just about every educational institution participating in today's webinar, the advancement operation has been asked to cut their budgets in some way. Some are able to accomplish it through attrition. They may have had open positions that they could use to address the short-term cuts. But if you're looking at an overall institutional cut that's well into the double digits, it's going to be difficult for advancement operations to weather that kind of budgetary retraction without taking some cuts themselves. And that gets us into the challenging territory of, if you are an income producing component of the institution, but you have to cut your budget, what do you cut? Where do you make your decisions about what you can live without while still providing as much income for the institution as you did before, or more, because the institutional needs now will be greater?
Yeah. Let me comment a little bit briefly on the healthcare and health sciences sector. This obviously has been the most vibrant sector in terms of giving related to COVID-19 over the last 3 months. We see many research-related institutions, academic health sciences centers have established really remarkable goals for COVID-related research, $20 million, $50 million, and they are getting it. They are raising multiple million-dollar gifts. And then even community hospitals, relatively small community hospitals with modest fundraising programs, have been raising six figures and $1 million around COVID-related care, whether it's for protective equipment, whether it's for relief for the healthcare workers themselves. So we've been seeing that sector really vibrantly raising money. The question is going to be, are those new donors going to stick with those healthcare organizations after the COVID crisis is over? And that's something that we can't predict at this point. They're getting lots of new gifts from lots of new donors, but are they developing loyalty, or is this more like the giving to a disaster that we see going into international programs in a lot of cases? Well, I'd like to go to another poll question now, because this all leads to how the current environment is affecting your fundraising programs. And what we are interested in is whether you have launched restricted gift initiatives to support COVID-19 priorities, or whether you've launched restricted gift initiatives to combat racial injustice, whether your programs and priorities have shifted but not to one of those, whether you've maintained your existing fundraising priorities or you've paused most of your fundraising efforts, and you can check any or all that apply. So please take a moment to vote on this poll as to how your fundraising priorities may have shifted. And while you're voting, I have a question from one of our participants who says, how do you see current racial tensions affecting campaigns and fundraising priorities? Nancy Raybin, let me turn to you to answer that. How do you see current racial tensions affecting campaigns and fundraising priorities?
Okay. So we're working with a number of clients who are in the middle of campaigns, and the discussions about the campaign priorities are front and center. The review of those priorities in light of the racial tensions, whether we're in Brooklyn or New Haven or New York or Washington, tend to be East Coast. It's palpable in terms of wanting to make sure that those priorities are not tone deaf and recognize some of the issues that those institutions are facing or should have been facing. That, combined with organizations paying more attention to their board composition, because if it's anything that we've learned in all of the years of doing board giving, in the last few years we focused on diversity, and we're learning that having a more diverse board, age or gender or ethnic or racial concerns, enhances the board. It doesn't reduce the funding that the board is able to produce, but it increases the conversation and the kind of conversation you have, such that making changes in campaign priorities, making changes in ongoing annual gift priorities with a board that understands these issues is the right kind of place to be and the right kind of conversation to have. Penelope's done some thinking in this area too, so let me turn it to her.
Thanks, Nancy. I'll address special initiatives around what's going on these days. We faced this question back in March with organizations wondering whether they should do special fundraising initiatives around needs related to the pandemic. And the question now has shifted to whether they should be doing special fundraising initiatives around the racial issues that have arisen, particularly in the US, but in many other countries as well. I think the most important thing to remember when considering from your organization's perspective whether to issue a fundraising appeal around something that is racially oriented is to make sure that it's a genuine, relevant, mission-connected purpose. The last thing you should do right now is appear to be jumping onto something that looks like a trend in some way. And to issue a fundraising appeal around Black Lives Matter or racial equity or defunding police departments without having a very strong and clearly articulated connection to your long-standing mission as an organization, not only will it not help you raise money, it will undercut your legitimacy and raise questions about your integrity. One of our Marts&Lundy clients who's participating in the webinar today, Chicago State University, has launched an initiative to provide 1,400 incoming freshmen, minority students with full tuition and support for things like textbooks, laptops, et cetera, to help address the difficulty minority populations face in completing college. And so by committing to them through their college experience, they are, that's their portion of addressing this problem. And what's important is that this is completely tied to Chicago State's longstanding mission. In fact, sure, before the most recent activities, Chicago State was already working on college to career pipeline programs and engaging alumni and mentoring first-time college students. So for them, this is mission connected and very genuine. If some other program suddenly announced a fundraising drive around similar issues but had no track record or mission in that area, it wouldn't have the same positive effect. So being genuine and maintaining integrity is critically important, more than ever right now.
Great points, Penelope and Nancy. Thanks. Well, let's go to our poll results and see how many of you have launched significant new initiatives. So 64% of you have launched COVID-related initiatives. Not surprising because the issues around racial injustice that have surfaced over just the last month or so are relatively new in terms of our thinking about fundraising priorities. Only 17% so far have launched gift initiatives around those issues. 65% of you say that you have maintained your existing gift priorities, and only 9% of you say that you have paused most fundraising efforts. Very, very interesting indeed. Thank you for voting on that. I want to open this up to questions from all of our participants. We've gotten a couple already. You can ask your questions in the chat function, and we will do our best to get to all of them. Here's a question now, which just says, talk about donor-advised funds. Who wants to talk about donor-advised funds?
I'll talk about donor-advised funds.
Who wants to talk about it?
I'll start. So I'm a holder and have been for a long time of donor-advised funds, donor-advised fund, and I enjoy giving from that fund even now. But what I've encouraged our clients to do is target those people who give from the donor-advised fund. It's no secret. And I have been getting requests, now that you're a donor-advised fund holder, will you consider? And so given the growth in these funds and the amount of money there, the fact that the money is already there, now is the time to ask as cleanly and clearly and directly as you can for those funds. The likelihood that more money will be going into donor-advised funds, whether at the commercial funds or community foundations, is high. It's an easy thing to do. It's a more accepted thing to do, and the ability to give at 5% or to give at 25% of what the money is there. But be direct with your donors. You know who gives through a donor-advised fund, so ask them to give more from that fund, and especially ask them on days when the market is up.
Yes.
Right.
And I am willing to admit that when donor-advised funds started growing in popularity, especially that giant rush at the end of 2017, I'm usually the Pollyanna of the crowd, but I was the cynic, and I said, listen, this money's just going to sit in these funds. It's not going to be given away. We're not going to, because they're not required to give away like foundations are. Thrilled to admit that I was completely wrong. The payouts from donor-advised funds, all the reports are showing, they're huge. 20, 25, 30% quarterly, annually. People who give into their donor-advised funds are giving that money away soon. It's not just sitting there. So y'all, this is free money. This is money from people who are already philanthropic. They have already decided to give it away. You don't have to convince them to give, they already gave. You have to show them how your organization is helping them accomplish their philanthropic goals. And if you can do that, there is no pain to that donor to support your organization, and you've just got to be right on top of it.
Right. The only thing I would add, Doug, is, it's $121 billion sitting in donor-advised funds. Last we counted, averages 21% payouts. Many of the community foundations at this moment are doing matching and challenging strategies with their donor-advised fund donors to inspire them to give into and give out of greater percentages of dollars. So you've got that also adding to this initiative. And just, we're seeing a lot of heroes giving, really actually just liquidating their donor-advised funds at this moment, giving heavily out of them. At the beginning of March, we were worried that we wouldn't see those replenished, but now the market has come back. So we're able to replenish those with appreciated securities. So I would message that to your donors. I would message that to your trustees. And it's all about showing them that you are worthy and you are urgent in your need at this moment.
Right.
And the only difference here is don't ask them to pledge. The language is make an intention. You handle the IRS rules perfectly well that way, and you can see some multi-year gifts. And it's also a wonderful technique to move lower dollar donors up to larger dollar donors.
Well, moving to a totally different topic, we have a question. How do you think the election will affect fundraising? Penelope, how's that crystal ball of yours again?
So my crystal ball is all lined up to answer this question on November 12th, 2020. I'll let you know. All we know is that presidential elections affect a lot of different types of behavior. They affect the economy, and it doesn't matter who wins the election. There is an effect of some sort. And the biggest thing we learned from the 2008 election was how many people made their first ever gift to a political campaign online, a $3 gift, a crowdfunded gift. That opened our eyes to an entry point into giving that hadn't occurred to us before. So what I would say is, over the next 5-6 months until the election, we should all just be paying very close and careful attention to how people are acting on what they believe and what the election means to them, and learn as much as we can about their giving behaviors from whatever happens, and be prepared that something's going to change. Whether it's a re-election or electing a new president, always something will change after the election. Stay on your toes and be nimble.
Yeah. I would say it's a lot of noise. It's a lot of distraction. So you have to think about your messaging in this moment. The other thing I would say is the election, we have a lot of public media clients. The election is driving gifts to strengthening our democracy. Those funders that are thinking about strengthening democracy, civil society, social justice are getting caught up in these issues around election. We're seeing a lot of giving from those funders that's inspired by what's going on the election side, to especially public media and some of our other initiatives.
So
the algorithm.
Yeah, go ahead, Nancy. Sorry.
I have to say, in 20 years ago, the algorithm that was part of Giving USA had the party of the incumbent president. And that was a factor that they had discovered influenced what charitable giving was going to be. We've since dropped that sort of calculation and that algorithm. And in fact, in the last 20 years, things were counterintuitive in terms of what was good for progressive organizations and what was good for conservative organizations. It was usually a president of the other party. I mean, I think now what Lynne and Penelope have to say is clearly right. There's just too much up in the air, and there are new donors being brought into this broader system. It used to be that 501c4 organizations, which were the political organizations, were separated from 501c3, and it was just different. But it's combined in many ways now. And I think we'll know better after the election, but I think we're seeing many more people giving money, period. And that's what's important.
Yeah.
The other part, excuse me, is also the crowdfunding. People are giving money in different ways, and paying attention to how people are giving that money is important.
So a couple of questions about campaigns. Our organization is considering starting a capital campaign. Is this a good time to start a major fundraising and philanthropic effort? Who wants to take that?
We can all nod our heads.
Yes is the answer.
Yes, I'm just finishing a feasibility study that started in March. We just ended the last interview last week. We're recommending $1 billion campaign. So it depends is the answer to that question, I think. If your priorities are urgent in this moment and in the foreseeable future, if they directly relate to some of the trends that are going on and you can really align with the interests of philanthropic donors at this moment. What we're seeing with this particular study is we are reprioritizing some of the priorities. So we're tuning those up because some of the issues have changed since March. But there are definitely organizations with great urgency, with great power that should be moving forward in this moment and will move forward in this moment and be successful.
Yeah.
We are finding that donors in feasibility study interviews are very happy to speak with us and to talk about an organization that they love. They've loved for 20 years or 30 years. They're anxious for in our case, as we are fundraising consultants, but in your case, as you are the professionals within the organization. The donors care about the organization. They're glad you care too, and they want to know what they can do at this point in time to ensure the long-term sustainability of the organization. It's a distraction, but it's a very important distraction, and people our donors are really interested in the future of organizations they care about. So now is the time for a campaign planning.
Lynn,
and I would say that developing a strong case has never been more important. If you're planning a campaign and you have your draft case, I would sit around a table and take that whole thing apart and ask yourself about every single priority. Why should somebody give to this right now? Why now? Why now? Why now? And if you don't have a really compelling reason for why what you're raising money for matters now, if you can't articulate that, your donors certainly won't be able to make the connection. So don't be afraid to toss it out and start over. This could be a very healthy exercise for anybody, campaign or not campaign, to ask yourself that about your case.
Well, and Lynn, we have a question here I'm going to go back to you on. It's related to this, and that is, what are you hearing from principal gift donors? And I know you have been doing a lot of campaign planning study interviews with donors. What are you hearing out there?
Yeah, so it's really interesting, and you know, I literally, we started this last study in March, and I finished it last week. So there was even a difference between what we were hearing in March and what we were hearing last week and in April. I mean, you could sort of see the changes. So heartened on a number of fronts. I actually spoke to a lot of people through this last study who were changing their planned giving plans. They were fast forwarding their giving into during their lifetime. So they had looked at their estate plans. They had looked at those organizations that they really care about, and they had decided to make gifts now during their lifetime to those organizations because they felt that the priorities were so urgent that they needed those dollars now. So that's a really good change that we saw. The finance people that we saw in this study were confident about the market, largely fueled by stimulus. So they're confident that those investments are going to be strong moving forward. But some of the older donors we saw in this mix were not very expansive in the way they wanted to look at a broad group of donors. So if you were already in their mix, they were already giving to you, you were already a high priority, they were prioritizing you, and they were actually doubling down in many cases on their giving to those institutions. But they weren't as willing to think about a next tier out of institutions to fund. And they were almost a bit embattled in terms of this moment. And I think the health issues were weighing very heavily on them and the unpredictability of those health issues. So not as expansive, but that group that's on the inner circle feeling fairly bullish actually at this moment in time.
Right.
So we have time for just one last question. I'm actually going to combine two questions. One is, what are you recommending for the next fiscal year fundraising goals and development budget processes for the organization in light of this conversation? And the other question that I think is related to that is, does anything that we are seeing now or any of the results from 2019 suggest any changes in development staffing? So what are we recommending in terms of goal setting for the coming fiscal year, and any suggestions on budgeting and staffing?
If I could start, building off of the foundation percentages in terms of Giving USA, we would be amiss not to look at how staffing funds are allocated to foundations. And again, what Penelepe had to say as well. They're going to play a larger role, and the attention to these foundations and funders is going to be even that much more important.
Yeah, I'm telling my groups to look at what happened during the last recession to sort of see what that performance was. If we look at The giving ratios, giving overall fell 14.6%, individual giving fell 16.7%. So I'm encouraging my groups to look at what happened to their donor populations and their numbers during that last period. And then I'm really encouraging them to just hand rate, literally look donor by donor at their top populations to see what they could imagine in the short term. And in terms of staffing, we're skewing major and principal gifts, Simplan giving staffing. That is where the dollars will be in the short term, especially in arts and culture. We are staffing up on our frontline fundraisers.
And pull your CFO into these conversations.
Absolutely.
The CFO needs to understand that you can't predict the way you may have always been able to predict in the past. And I'm recommending budgeting for a flat budget and setting a goal at flat or slightly down. As Lynn points out, you'll be able to know what happened last time around. In higher education, I'm recommending being conservative because we haven't faced anything quite like this before. And then evaluate quarterly. Same with staffing measures and performance metrics. Every quarter, reevaluate and adjust your goal or target if you need to. And that's why your CFO needs to be part of these conversations to understand that they are probably looking at the overall institutional budget with a similar eye because of so much uncertainty. The partnership between the Chief Development Officer and Chief Financial Officer, super important going into next year.
Yeah, great. The other thing, in relation to the question about fundraising goals, is that we're seeing a number of our clients setting goals in terms of a range now, rather than the actual dollar goal that they have traditionally set. They're saying, they're doing some risk analysis in essence and saying, our goal last year was $50 million. This coming year, we are projecting a goal in the range of $42 to $52 million or something like that.
Yeah.
So we're at the end of our hour. I'm going to ask each of our panelists if they choose to, if they have one parting word of advice for our participants. Penelepe, anything to leave our participants with?
Keep the faith. Your organization has never needed you more than they need you right now.
Yeah, thank you. Nancy, Raybin?
I was going to say the same thing. You need to stay the course. You have the skills, you have the relationships, you have the analytic abilities, and you have the charm. And it's important to use this up and down your organization and throughout your donor base.
Great, thanks. And Lynne, Heinrich, you got the last word.
Never waste a good crisis. Be bold. Look at what you've tried to change for a long time, that you have the moment to change, and be passionate. You all are doing amazing work.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our participants. We've enjoyed having this virtual conversation with you. We wish you all the best. Stay healthy and safe, and stay close to your missions. Thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.